The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage as Catherine, Princess of Wales, carefully arranged white roses in a crystal vase. The quiet routine of her morning was suddenly interrupted by the urgent ring of her phone. William's voice on the other end carried a weight she had rarely heard before, even through years of royal duties and personal challenges. "Catherine, we need to talk. Something has happened." His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and she immediately knew this wasn't about their usual royal engagements or family matters. There was something deeper, more profound in his tone, that made her heart skip a beat. Within minutes, William arrived home earlier than expected from his morning appointments. His usually composed demeanor showed cracks of vulnerability as he sat across from her in their private sitting room. The news he delivered would reshape not just their immediate future, but test everything they had learned about duty, compassion, and public service. A beloved figure in their circle, someone who had been like family to them both, had passed away, unexpectedly. The person had been instrumental in their early married life, offering wisdom and guidance during some of their most challenging moments. This wasn't just another state funeral or ceremonial obligation they would need to attend. This was personal, deeply personal. Catherine watched as William struggled to find the right words. She had seen him handle countless difficult situations with grace and determination. But this was different. The loss hit at the core of who they were as people, not just as public figures. They both understood immediately that their response to this tragedy would need to balance their private grief with their public responsibilities. The weight of expectation began to settle around them like a familiar but unwelcome coat. They knew that every gesture, every expression, every word they spoke in the coming days would be scrutinized by millions around the world. Yet in this moment, sitting in the sanctuary of their home, they were simply two people grappling with unexpected loss. As they held each other in the quiet of their sitting room, both William and Catherine began to understand that this farewell would require them to dig deeper into their reserves of strength than they had ever done before. They would need to find a way to honor their private grief while serving as pillars of comfort for others who were equally devastated by this loss. The phone began ringing again, and they knew that beyond their front door, the machinery of royal protocol was already in motion. Staff members would be coordinating schedules, security details would be reassessing routes and venues, and press secretaries would be preparing statements. But for just a few more moments, they allowed themselves to simply sit with their sorrow. Catherine reached for William's hand, finding the strength they had always drawn from each other during difficult times. They both knew that in the hours and days ahead, they would need to transform their personal pain into something that could provide solace and dignity for everyone affected by this loss. The true test of their character was about to begin. The next morning brought a flurry of activity that contrasted sharply with the heavy silence that had settled over the Wales household. Catherine found herself moving through the familiar routines of preparing for a significant royal engagement, but everything felt different now. Each black dress she considered, each piece of jewelry she examined, carried the weight of farewell rather than celebration. William had left early for emergency meetings at Kensington Palace, where senior royal staff were working around the clock to coordinate what would become one of the most watched ceremonial events of the year. The logistics were staggering: security arrangements, protocol decisions, guest lists that included heads of state and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by the deceased. In the quiet moments between preparations, Catherine reflected on the countless conversations she had shared with the person they were now preparing to honor. There had been afternoon teas where wisdom was shared over delicate china cups, long walks through palace gardens where advice was offered without judgment, and family gatherings where laughter had filled rooms that now felt impossibly quiet. Children had been told about the loss in gentle terms appropriate for their ages, but Catherine could see the confusion in their eyes. Death was still an abstract concept for them, yet they sensed the gravity of the situation from the unusual solemnity that had settled over their parents. George asked thoughtful questions that showed his growing understanding of his family's unique role in the world, while Charlotte offered quiet hugs that spoke to her intuitive emotional intelligence. As Catherine helped select flowers for the various arrangements they would present, she found herself remembering specific moments of kindness and guidance that had shaped her journey from a commoner to a future queen. The person they were mourning had been instrumental in helping her navigate the complex expectations and traditions of royal life, always with patience and understanding. William returned home that evening looking more tired than she had seen him in months. The burden of organizing a farewell that would satisfy both protocol and genuine emotion was taking its toll. They sat together in their private study, sharing stories and memories that wouldn't make it into any official biography or newspaper article, but which formed the true foundation of their grief. The palace staff had presented them with preliminary schedules and arrangements for the coming days. There would be a lying-in state, multiple services, and countless opportunities for the public to pay their respects. William and Catherine would need to be present for most of these events, serving as both mourners and sources of comfort for others experiencing similar loss. Catherine found herself thinking about the delicate balance they would need to strike. Too much emotion might be seen as unprofessional or overwhelming for those looking to them for stability. Too little might appear cold or disconnected from the genuine affection that had defined their relationship with the deceased. Finding the right tone would require them to draw upon every lesson they had learned about public service. Late that night, as they reviewed the final arrangements and approved the official statements that would be released to the press, both William and Catherine felt the full weight of their unique position. They were not just mourners. They were representatives of a nation's grief, symbols of continuity in the face of loss, and guardians of dignity in a moment when emotions ran high. The realization was both humbling and daunting, but it also crystallized their sense of purpose in a way that few experiences ever had. The first public appearance since the announcement came sooner than either William or Catherine had expected. They were scheduled to visit the cathedral where the main service would eventually take place, to inspect arrangements and meet with clergy members who would be conducting the ceremonies. It would be their first test of how well they could balance personal grief with public duty. Catherine chose a simple black coat and minimal jewelry, understanding instinctively that this moment called for understated elegance rather than royal grandeur. As their car approached the cathedral, they could see small clusters of people already gathering, some holding flowers, others simply standing in respectful silence. The sight of these early mourners reminded them both of the broader impact this loss would have on countless lives. Inside the cathedral, the preparations were already well underway. Flowers were being arranged with military precision, seating charts were being reviewed for the 5th time, and sound technicians were testing equipment to ensure that every word of the eventual service would be heard clearly by those in attendance and broadcast to millions more watching from home. William walked slowly down the aisle where he would soon follow a coffin, his measured steps echoing in the vast space. Catherine watched him from a distance, seeing not the future king, but a man processing his own mortality and the fragility of all human connections. When he paused at the altar rail, she knew he was thinking about all the conversations and shared experiences that would now exist only in memory. The dean of the cathedral approached them with a gentle dignity that immediately put them both at ease. He had conducted many significant services over the years, but he understood that this one would require a special sensitivity to both protocol and genuine emotion. As he walked them through the planned order of service, both William and Catherine offered thoughtful suggestions that would honor their personal relationship with the deceased while respecting the formal requirements of such an occasion. When they emerged from the cathedral an hour later, the small crowd had grown considerably. People pressed forward with flowers, cards, and quiet words of sympathy. This was the moment Catherine had been both anticipating and dreading, the first real interaction with the public since the loss had been announced. She found herself genuinely moved by the sincerity of the strangers who approached them. An elderly woman pressed a handwritten note into her gloved hand, whispering that the deceased had once helped her through a difficult period in her own life. A young father lifted his daughter so she could present a small bouquet of daisies, explaining that they had picked them from their garden that morning. William, meanwhile, was approached by a group of veterans who had served alongside the deceased in various charitable capacities over the years. Their weathered faces showed a mixture of grief and pride as they shared brief stories of service and dedication. These interactions reminded him that their loss was shared by people from every walk of life and every corner of the kingdom. As they prepared to leave, Catherine noticed that their own grief had begun to transform into something larger and more purposeful. The weight of representing others in their sorrow was actually providing them with a sense of direction and meaning that private mourning alone could never have achieved. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than they had experienced in recent days. Both of them were beginning to understand how they might channel their personal loss into something that could provide comfort and closure for everyone affected by this death. The path forward was becoming clearer, even as their sadness remained just as profound. The day of the main ceremony arrived with an unseasonably gray sky that seemed to mirror the collective mood of the nation. Catherine woke before dawn, unable to sleep through the final hours, before what would be one of the most emotionally challenging days of her public life. She moved quietly through their bedroom, careful not to disturb William, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep after days of preparation and coordination. Standing at their bedroom window, she watched as security teams made their final preparations in the streets below. Barriers were being adjusted, routes were being cleared, and the intricate choreography of a major royal event was being fine-tuned down to the smallest detail. She knew that within hours, these same streets would be lined with thousands of people, all seeking their own way to say goodbye. William stirred as the morning light grew stronger, and they shared a quiet breakfast together, speaking little but drawing strength from their familiar routines. Both of them understood that once they left their home that morning, they would essentially be on public duty for the next 12 hours, with little opportunity for private moments or unguarded emotions. Their children would remain at home, deemed too young for such a solemn public event, but not before offering their parents the kind of innocent wisdom that often comes from those who haven't yet learned to complicate simple truths. Charlotte had suggested they take extra handkerchiefs, while Louis had drawn a picture that he insisted would make everyone feel better. George, with his growing awareness of his family's role, had simply hugged his parents a little tighter than usual. The journey to Westminster Abbey was made in ceremonial state cars, moving slowly enough to acknowledge the crowds that had gathered along the route. Catherine found herself making eye contact with individual faces in the crowd, seeing her own sense of loss reflected back at her from people of all ages and backgrounds. A young mother held up her toddler to wave, while elderly couples stood, with quiet dignity, many holding photographs that suggested personal connections to the deceased. Inside the abbey, the atmosphere was heavy with expectation and reverence. World leaders, members of the royal family, representatives from charitable organizations, and ordinary citizens who had been touched by the deceased's work all sat together in a way that transcended normal social boundaries. Catherine took her seat beside William, acutely aware that every gesture and expression would be captured by cameras and remembered by history. As the service began, Catherine felt the full weight of representing not just her own grief, but the collective sorrow of everyone present. When the first hymn began, she could hear voices breaking with emotion throughout the vast space. and she realized that her role was to provide a steadying presence for others who were struggling with their own feelings. William's tribute, delivered, with a voice that remained steady despite the obvious depth of his emotion, captured both the personal and public dimensions of their loss. He spoke of private conversations and public service, of laughter shared and challenges overcome, of a legacy that would continue to influence their family and their work for generations to come. When it came time for Catherine to lay their wreath, she moved with the measured grace that years of royal training had ingrained in her, but her touch lingered just a moment longer than protocol required. In that gesture, observers could see the genuine affection and respect that motivated her public composure. The final blessing was followed by a silence so profound that it seemed to encompass not just the abbey, but the entire nation pausing, to acknowledge what had been lost and what would be remembered. As they prepared to leave, both William and Catherine understood that they had succeeded in creating the kind of farewell that honored both the personal relationships and public service that had defined a remarkable life. The reception following the main service presented William and Catherine with their greatest challenge yet, navigating hundreds of personal conversations while maintaining the emotional strength to provide comfort to others who were equally grieving. The Great Hall at Buckingham Palace had been transformed into a space that felt both formal enough for heads of state and warm enough for intimate remembrances. Catherine found herself in conversation after conversation with people whose lives had been touched in different ways by the person they were honoring. A teacher from Scotland spoke about educational initiatives that had transformed her school. A young man from Wales described how a chance meeting had changed the trajectory of his career. Each story added another layer to her understanding of just how far-reaching the impact of one life could be. What struck her most profoundly was how often these conversations revealed aspects of the deceased's character that had been hidden from public view. Acts of private kindness, anonymous donations, personal letters written during times of crisis. The picture that emerged was of someone whose public service was only the visible portion of a much larger commitment to helping others. William, meanwhile, was managing his own series of emotionally demanding conversations. Foreign dignitaries offered formal condolences while sharing their own memories of state visits and international collaborations. Family friends spoke more intimately about shared holidays and quiet moments that had strengthened bonds over decades of friendship. One conversation particularly moved him, with a young soldier who had been severely injured in service to his country. The deceased had visited him in hospital and maintained contact throughout his long recovery, never seeking publicity for these acts of compassion. As the soldier described how those visits had sustained him through his darkest moments, William felt a renewed appreciation for the kind of service that operates away from cameras and headlines. Catherine noticed how naturally William seemed to absorb others' grief while offering comfort in return. She watched him listen with complete attention to an elderly woman who had worked as a housekeeper for 30 years, giving her story the same respectful focus he would offer to any world leader. These moments reminded her why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. His genuine care for people, regardless of their status or position. As the afternoon progressed, both of them began to see patterns in the stories they were hearing. Themes of encouragement, practical help, and quiet leadership emerged again and again. People described feeling heard, valued, and supported in ways that had enabled them to overcome significant challenges in their own lives. The most moving moment came when a group of children from one of the deceased's favorite charities presented. William and Catherine with a memory book they had created together. Each page contained drawings, poems, and simple messages that captured their understanding of loss and love in ways that were far more eloquent than many of the formal tributes they had heard. Looking through the book together, William and Catherine realized that these children had grasped something essential about how to honor someone's memory, not through grand gestures or elaborate ceremonies, but through small acts of kindness and creativity that reflected the spirit of the person being remembered. As the reception began to wind down, both of them felt a shift in their own understanding of grief and remembrance. The formal ceremonies had been necessary and meaningful, but these personal conversations had revealed the true measure of a life well lived. They understood now that their own mourning process would be enriched by continuing the work and values that had made their loss feel so significant. The final guests departed as evening shadows grew longer, leaving William and Catherine alone with their thoughts and the profound sense that they had participated in something much larger than a traditional funeral or memorial service. They had witnessed and facilitated a celebration of human connection that would influence how they approached their own service for years to come. 3 weeks after the funeral, William and Catherine sat in their private garden at Adelaide Cottage, watching their children play among the autumn leaves. The intense public scrutiny had finally subsided. The endless stream of condolence letters had been acknowledged, and the immediate demands of ceremonial mourning had been fulfilled. Now came the harder task of integrating their loss into the ongoing rhythm of their lives and work. Catherine had begun each morning by reading through some of the thousands of letters they had received from ordinary citizens around the world. The messages revealed how deeply the deceased had touched lives in ways that extended far beyond official duties or public appearances. A farmer from Australia wrote about conservation advice that had saved his family's land. A student from Canada described a scholarship that had made her education possible. Each letter reinforced her growing understanding of how individual acts of service could ripple outward across generations. William had thrown himself into reviewing the various charitable initiatives and causes that would now need new leadership and direction. Rather than simply maintaining existing programs, he and Catherine had begun discussions about how they might honor their friend's memory by expanding and deepening this work. They talked late into several evenings about creating new partnerships, developing innovative approaches to long-standing problems, and finding ways to make their own service more personal and direct. The children had adapted to the changes in their parents' mood and schedule with the resilience that often surprises adults. George had begun asking thoughtful questions about what it meant to help people, while Charlotte had started setting aside some of her pocket money for charity. Even young Louis seemed to sense that something important was happening, offering extra hugs when his parents seemed particularly thoughtful or sad. One evening, while reviewing plans for their upcoming royal tour, Catherine realized that their approach to public engagements had been fundamentally changed by their recent experience. They now understood more clearly how much individual attention and genuine interest could mean to people they met. The deceased had demonstrated this through decades of making every person feel valued and heard, regardless of how brief their interaction might be. William had begun incorporating more spontaneous elements into their official schedule, creating opportunities for unplanned conversations and genuine connections. During a recent visit to a hospital, he had spent an extra hour simply talking with patients and staff, ignoring the carefully timed schedule that usually governed such events. The feedback had been overwhelmingly positive, with many people commenting on how natural and unrushed the interaction had felt. They had also made the decision to establish a new foundation that would continue and expand some of the deceased's most important work. Rather than simply adding another organization to their existing portfolio of patronages, they planned to be directly involved in its daily operations, bringing the same hands-on approach that had made their friend's service so effective. Catherine found particular meaning in planning programs that would support families dealing with unexpected loss. Her own experience of navigating grief while maintaining public responsibilities had given her insights into challenges that many people face without the support systems available to the royal family. She envisioned creating resources and networks that could provide practical help during some of life's most difficult transitions. As winter approached, both William and Catherine felt that they had emerged from their period of mourning with a deeper appreciation for the responsibility and opportunity that their positions provided. They had witnessed firsthand how individual acts of compassion could create lasting change in people's lives, and they were determined to make that understanding central to their future work. The evening light was fading as they called the children inside for supper, but both of them felt a quiet sense of purpose that had been missing from their lives before their recent loss. They had learned that the best way to honor someone's memory was not through monuments or ceremonies, but through continuing their work with the same spirit of genuine care and service that had made their friend's life so meaningful. In choosing to move forward together, they had found a way to transform grief into grace and personal loss into renewed commitment to others.